friends, we're gonna how about Sister V? You all know the drill. I'm Bonnie Perry. I'm your bishop. This is Sister Veronica Dunbar, and we are your book study people. So, Sister V, if you start us off with prayer, and we will go from there. Barbara's got her knitting, so she's all set. That's it. Knit, pray, friend. Absolutely.
The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Gracious God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for words of wisdom and for the gift of language and writing that we've encountered in this book. Bless us as we read together and as we listen to one another. Bless us to continue the work that you began to bring our humanity back to us in the full glory that you intended. Bless us to learn even more deeply to love one another and to learn to love ourselves as you see us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
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 So, and we're gonna work both chat and talking, but try to be aware of all the other folks on the call with our talking. So make great use of the chat, but tell me, so this would be the part where you jump in, and if you're not talking, mute yourself, but when you are talking, unmute. Tell me, what'd you think of the book? How did this part of it land on you?
Well,
Brutally
me,
honest.
Brenda,
Brutally.
She certainly made her case that we are a caste society, without a doubt.
Yeah. Brenda, were you trying to jump in there?
well, yeah, that it's wonderful that I can see America as a caste system too. I mean, that was quite informative. And I tried to compare it with the places that I knew were caste systems. So I'm still working with that.
Yeah.
I think I agree that using the word caste seems to manage to get away from the loadedness of the word race and racism, which I think is a very valuable place for the exploration to happen that Isabel Wilkerson wants to have happen. But I think she's also in the business of shocking people out of their complacency. So I think the chapter, when she compares it to the Third Reich, which we all know exactly what we think about the Third Reich as being criminal, prosecuted criminal offenses on the global world, and America is worse. The Nazis could not believe how bad America was. They didn't even go that far when they wrote their laws. She is in here to shock and to get people to react.
The word I kept finding myself using was searing. Just searing. Jim, you said that Warmth of the Other Suns zipped along like a narrative, but this one, it's a little, it moved along a bit slower for you.
Yeah, it's just denser, not quite as dense as the new Jim Crow, but it's more about ideas. And Warmth of Other Suns was just a real page turner. This is more, you read, there's more to think about it, but it's just a very different book.
But having read The Warmth of Other Suns, I can see how this book evolved from it, and how, as she mentions, that it was taking place in her mind a little bit as she was doing Warmth of Other Suns. And as you read along, you can see where she probably drew from a lot of the research that she did. And I just want to say too, in this beginning part, when she did a very, maybe 2 or 3 page summary of kind of Donald Trump's candidacy and presidency, I just lived 4 years of anxiety in those 3 or 4 pages. And that just a context. I also thought her analogy to a virus or pathogens being below the surface or in a body or whatever and coming back because they haven't been dealt with was just very interesting.
So, Karen, perfect lead in to where we were going to go. So you win. Thank you very much. Her writing, oh my God. I mean, as someone who preaches and loves words, oh, I was just reveling in this. The metaphor that struck me, and so this is my question. So I'm going to give you mine. I'm going first, so I get it in. But I want you to, which of her metaphors that she used, which one describing caste, which one really stood out for you? The one that I loved, and I loved all of them, but the one that I had special resonance with was one that's on page 16, and she talks about living owners of an old house. Now, for 27 years, I was the rector of the oldest wooden frame church still in use in the city of Chicago. And for years we said, and it looks it. So this idea of, as she says, that the unaddressed, the ruptured and diagonal cracks will not fix themselves. The toxins will not go away, but rather will spread, leach, and mutate as they already have. Here we go.
Yep.
When people live in an old house, they come to adjust to the idiosyncrasies and outright dangers skulking in an old structure. They put buckets under a wet ceiling. Remember Beth Taylor? They prop up groaning floors, learn to step over the wooden tread in the staircase. The awkward becomes acceptable, and the unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. Live with it long enough, and the unthinkable becomes normal. Exposed over the generations, we learn to believe that the incomprehensible is the way that life is supposed to be.
That's what's happening in Washington right now.
It echoes some reading that a group at All Saints is doing of Howard Thurman.
Yeah, we're reading that too.
The threat of violence. But the phrase that keeps echoing for me, and I'm not finished with it, is knowing your place. Knowing your place. And it echoes from a mother who was born and raised and lived really her entire life in the Mid-South as someone of lower middle income and, knowing your place.
Thank
And
you.
the Black women that she knew, the thing that, we all have to know our place.
Yeah. What are those what are those other metaphors struck you, friends?
I don't know if it's a metaphor per se. Hi, I'm Dot from Commerce.
Hey, Dot from Commerce.
But I just remember a part where she said to speak is not to speak, or when you're not speaking, you're speaking. When you're not acting, you're acting. When you were just, Carol, I think it was talking about the complacency. That's what's happening. When we're complacent, we're actively not doing those things. We're actively not acting out. We're actively not having a voice.
Yep. Perfect. Others?
I also think the old house description analogy is also important because it talks about how we have ownership of this. It may be something that happened in the past. I mean, the house was built many years ago, but we're the ones who own it now. And if we don't address it, it's going to fall down on us. And that's what speaks to me quite a bit.
Yep. What about all the different uses it turns out that there are for the word caste?
Yeah, I like the metaphor of the casting roles in a play. That, you are that role. You can't come out of it because otherwise the play will not work.
What are you doing saying my lines, right?
Exactly.
Or the idea of a cast on your arm and how rigid it is. And so once it's hardened, you can't move within it. You can only move a couple centimeters each way.
Yeah, and so Jim is saying, yeah, there were so many, right? They just keep standing, and I think that was the part about when you're preaching and you're kind of building to your point, and Hebrew poetry, the Psalms, right? It's this notion. It's not like rhyming per se, but it says something, and then it says the same thing in a slightly different manner, and the same thing in a slightly different manner. It's just this building and layering. So
I had another thought on caste, is that the caster, she, makes a point of saying, where is that from the Portuguese? And in fact, it's very similar to the raza with the race, with the horses and the studs and the breeding. And it's actually about the blood. And I thought for caster, though, it's the same origin as the word chaste. And we understand chaste and chastity. And what that brings in is honor, family honor, and this need to defend. And I think that's a little bit of what is kind of missed in just calling it caste, but actually as one of the overtones that's really important about race caste is that there is this, you're impugning something that's to do with my honor, with my whole. It isn't just my actions. It isn't just the structures. It's my very essence that I am willing to die for, to uphold, like the honor of my daughter, the chastity of my daughter. I've been impugned because she's no longer chaste. That's where caste, I think, if we just use caste and say, oh, Indian caste system, Third Reich, we've lost that, almost the honor to uphold it is so much part of the importance of
it strikes me, Carolyn, I'm sorry, let me just say this. It strikes me that it's those upper castes who would hold on to the honor that they have to defend, less than those who have been cast in the play in a lower role. I'm not sure I'm buying the honor that we have to fight for to maintain. It's only the upper castes that might hold on to it like that. I'm not sure the lower castes would do so because they're the ones who suffer. So I just have to respond. That's all.
And then, it's interesting. And Carol Maters, she talked about that incident where someone named their daughter Miss in order to force people to call a Black girl Miss by a title. But what this brings to mind, what Carolyn and Debbie were talking about is well, what is the definition of caste? And she gives us very clear definitions on page 70. Caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. So you make this hierarchy. You decide who's on the top and who's on the bottom. And, there are many divisions. And Helen Santos, you just said, there's more than two divisions. There's many rankings within this hierarchy. And so it's this really good definition. How did that definition strike you? Did anyone else I have a lot of highlighting in this book. Did anyone else kind of highlight that one and say, yeah? How did that definition of caste strike you?
It took me a while to get on her same wavelength. I've already read the book once, and then I started reading it again for tonight's discussion. And only on this second reading did I kind of get to where she was going, because I couldn't see a difference. I couldn't see how caste was different than racism until the second reading. And you're right, the way she defines what it takes to have a system like that, what it does to organize people and their thoughts about themselves and their thoughts about others.
I was struck on that same page by the sentence, caste is insidious and therefore powerful because it is not hatred. It is not necessarily personal. So it means that, for example, people can have fairly good relationships with each other, but still within those relationships, they have to maintain this caste system, which is kind of a rigorous ordering of society that's outside of themselves. And so because it's outside of them, they just let it work, they let it work. And so it doesn't bring in the feelings that might accompany realizing how sad or how horrible it might make someone else's life.
I found the definition, I find it very disturbing. And I get angry because it takes away, I think it takes away the idea of trying to be an inclusive society, to be a diverse society, because we have to be locked into these boxes. And who is some, white supreme billionaire to say that you're lesser than me? I mean, that's what I hear and that's what I see. And I find it very disturbing.
Yeah, but it's the water we swim in, and it's the way that our society, our American society, was organized from the very beginning. And a small example of that I see in my little microcosm, my kids go to a very small school, and I was shocked, but not shocked when I realized, and their teachers told me that it happens all over the place, where kids somewhere around middle school publish a ranking starting with 1 to, let's say, 100 kids of the most popular or the most beautiful or the smartest, and they publish it anonymously, and the kids all see it, and they know where they fall to that, that place, and it was so disturbing to me. I except for I realized in reading this book that is how we are organized. And part of our tasks as Christians, I just want to say this one thing. I loved the introduction of the book, or the dedication of the book, where she talks about, she dedicates it to the memory of Brett who defied it. So it seems like our task as Christians and as leaders in the Christian way is to learn and teach and embody what it means to defy this false system that we have inherited, and primarily for race in this construct, but in every construct, to defy it, to reject it.
I just want to respond to you and what you said about the children that ranked each other. Middle school is when babies are they're finding their way in the world, and they're modeling our world.
Right.
They're ranking people because that's what we do. And they're finding their way by ranking people. They're modeling what they see in the greater world. It's unnerving and horrifying.
Somebody said
Sorry.
something that reminded me of we saw a video in a Zoom meeting at our church with a goldfish swimming in a goldfish bowl. And the only line in the whole thing is, the goldfish doesn't know that he's wet. And I immediately thought of white privilege. People don't know
Yeah.
they have white privilege because it's what they live with. It's their whole entire environment. To them, it's just the way things are.
Yeah.
That struck me listening, excuse me, that has struck me listening to what people have been mentioning, the involuntary nature of this thing that we're participating in. And to the question asked by Bishop Bonnie at the beginning, maybe it's the Gen X in me, but I love the metaphor of the Matrix. And how these programs are kind of working in behind us, and and we don't become aware of it. And then when we become aware of it, we become a threat to the system as well. Yeah, that really that resonated with me.
Katie, I was reading it and I was like, oh my God, it's the Matrix. And then I was really annoyed because I think it was a three-part thing, and I only ever watched one of them, so I didn't know who won. So then I got a little worried. And Keanu Reeves really can't act, but I do kind of feel like it is. You guys get bored? Watch the Matrix. But the definition on 17, someone said about caste. I hear that one is also, Beth, it's a little bit to what you were referring to, I think. It's like caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It's the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions, Looking at caste is like holding the country's X-ray up to the light. It says caste is, and then she says in another spot, caste is the bones, race is the skin. It's like, whoa.
I had an opportunity this morning when I was helping my granddaughter with online school. One of the things that she had to do in this comprehension test that she was taking was read the Declaration of Independence. Well, so anyway, we had a little discussion about how that really, all that was devised by white men who owned property, and that the structure that they built politically, which was an improvement supposedly from what they had before, really reflected their values. And that was the beginning of, not the beginning, but it was an official assertion of the caste system. The caste system began, when the first Africans came here as slaves, and the first time we met Native Americans and all that. But the caste system was codified at that moment when it said white men who own property can vote and they will run the country.
Yeah, she does. I mean, she connects so many dots in this book.
Yeah.
When you guys were reading this, did you, and you started, sort of seeing the water in the fishbowl or suddenly being aware of the Matrix, did you start thinking of ways in which you could suddenly see how this was playing out in your daily life? Could you think of instances where you went, oh, that was caste at work?
Like I put 52 years in at General Motors at 4 different GM facilities. And I can say from my seat, there's no question that caste exists in the workplace and anywhere else. But that's how that corporation functioned within the plants. I'm sure Mary Barra would disagree with me, but I saw it every day, and I responded to people from both ends of the caste system and all the different levels in between. The concept of somebody being able to be an engineer but not a manager was not unusual. Somebody getting a job but not deserving it because the system's forcing it on us happened every day. And I just got to tell you, a white guy at GM just has to walk in the room, he's in charge. And that's the way it's been. Now, I started in '68 and I finished this summer, and nothing changed. It was always the same. So caste, to me, I love this. I'm on the book the 3rd time, and I'm learning and I'm learning and I'm learning. But it's right on. It's right on the button. And I really do enjoy knowing that. But I got to say, just the experience of living through it. And that was Detroit, Flint, Ypsilanti, and Toledo. I mean, 4 different areas. And it was always the same. And it was that way when I walked out of there last March. when they closed the plant for a couple months. So that's where I saw it.
Yeah.
What I would like to start doing is I wrote, what if I started saying I am part German and part Polish, rather than checking off on my vaccination registration, I'm white or Caucasian? What if I fill out the forms differently? I cross off those options and I put German and Polish rather than white, Black, Latino, Asian. You know, we self-created that in our country. The people from Europe, they and every, you know, in a lot of places, they labeled themselves what their true ethnicity was. Not white, not Black, not Asian. And that's
she talks about the creation of whiteness as a necessity for this caste system that we have in America.
Are you listening to
and as I was reading this, because okay, so I think about Jesus a lot. You might have guessed that. I started thinking about the caste system that Jesus encountered in the first century Palestine. When did Jesus run up against this caste system? And because she's a favorite of mine, I thought of the Canaanite woman who really challenges Jesus about his understanding of the caste system. And wait, what are these Galilean fishermen doing, you know, in leadership positions? And, you know, well, wow, if Jesus, we see Jesus learning about the caste system that he took for granted when it came to the Canaanite woman. And we also see him breaking through that caste system and choosing his disciples. How do we model that? Like Debbie said, if that's the model we should be looking at, the one we should be imitating, how are we doing that? And I think, you know, that's kind of a blueprint for action as people of faith.
How many of you have read White Trash?
I have not read it yet. It's on my reading list.
Because I think some amount of the folks who ascribe to and aspire to white privilege, if you will, come at it from a place of a significantly lower rank in the white world, so to speak. Anybody have that same outlook on it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would believe that working class white folks will be more protective of their honor and their place and so forth. That was my experience growing up, Carol. I think that's absolutely accurate. They have more to protect. They don't. Anyway,
I think the way Deb, the way she's talking about it, is she talks about there's a dominant caste, a subservient caste that is always identifying with the caste above, having to maintain status by pushing that caste down. And so the part that I want to go to is this notion about she has a gazillion beautiful lines, but the one I want to talk about right now is on page 43. But in the same way, this notion about how are we honest about our past, in the same way that individuals cannot move forward, become whole and healthy unless they examine the domestic violence they witnessed as children or the alcoholism that runs in their family, the country cannot become whole until it confronts what was not a chapter in its history, but the basis of its economic and social order. And here's the thing that struck me. For a quarter millennium, slavery was the country.
I have all that underlined.
Same here. Same here.
Were struck by the number of different ways she talked about the length of time.
Mhm.
Like she's at one point it's 12 generations.
So what they want to confront it, because by confronting it means the fact that slavery built the country.
Right.
That's how we got to Wall Street.
Right.
And they're still doing well off the backs of slavery. So they don't want to stop that.
Right.
They got a good thing going. Why would you want to stop it?
And I think that, Wilma, that would be the people who own the computers in the matrix.
Right.
I mean, that is the group that is making the money and keeping it codified
For themselves.
Yeah.
I think the closer we get to 2040, that date that she talks about when the white majority will no longer be the white majority, the closer we get to that, I think we're going to hear more and more of the holding on to a culture war, of holding on to that patriotic, ideal of what our country was formed for, and anyone who shines a light on it or tries to reveal the matrix is going to be dismissed, and so we have to build a muscle to tell the truth, because our very identity as Americans is going to be called in. Our Black brothers and sisters deal with this all the time. White people, we've got to get used to being called out and dismissed and diminished, but we've still got to keep shining the light.
That's why the white supremacists are kicking up so much right now. They're terrified of the time when the white people will no longer be the majority of this country. So they're doing what they can now to somehow maintain power, even though they're not the majority.
Right. And there's a publication that I learned about from my very conservative aunt that Bill knows about, Aunt Margaret in South Dakota. And there's a publication in a system of journalism and newspapers, international newspapers, called the Epic Times. And they reflect, these very conservative, I'm going to say conservative, but beyond conservative, into white supremacist thoughts. And one thing that they preach against is critical race theory, they call it. They do not want us to tell the truth about our history. And most of us, certainly in my generation, grew up with history that was essentially propaganda about our country. I never learned that George Washington had slaves. I never knew that Thomas Jefferson had slaves and had children with a slave. That never entered into the picture. We just learned that they were fine, upstanding people, and we were on the right side of everything, right? If you're white, that's good, but always be nice to the Black people. My mother told me that. She says, be nice to them, but don't bring them home as your little friends. That's what my mother said. So there was this, they don't want us to talk about that. They don't want us to change our views. They don't want the truth to come out. They want to maintain this lie that we're all living.
And I think that's part about being honest about our past. But it's also, I think, when we think from a faith perspective, how much of spiritual discipline is about honest self-reflection? How much is it about looking at ourselves and saying, okay, this is the part that I'm playing. This is the role I've been cast in. And what's the spiritual response to that? Spiritually, how do we break out of the caste system? And how do we do that self-reflection collectively, not just as individuals, but as a church and as a society? How do we look at ourselves honestly and say, okay, this is the role I've been cast in. What is the spiritual response? Spiritual with a capital S, because I'm thinking of the Holy Spirit. What is the spiritual response to that? We're coming up on Pentecost, and we have that, reading. We read it every year about, all those people gathered together in Jerusalem, and, they're speaking all these different languages. I think the spirit was kind of probably messing with the caste system a little bit there. How do we do the same?
One quick comment is that I know that a number of St. Clarians are participating in the 3-part series on the Episcopal Church's racial audit. Once we finish the 3rd part, and we wanted to leap into action, we said, no, there are 2 more sessions, let's wait. But we would like to find a way, our EEAC, our Equity Education Action Committee, we want to find a way to do an internal audit of our own congregation.
Beautiful.
It's more than just an individual, it's really a faith community.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. Marcia, you managed to figure out how to raise your hand electronically, friend. Well played. I still haven't figured it out.
Well, I just was going to make a tiny little comment about what Beth said of, predicting what will happen in 2040. I think we saw it today with Liz Cheney. How terrible. I mean, I'm not a Republican, but how terrible. I think obviously it's going on now.
Well, and I mean, I think, if we want to, we can pivot. But the one other piece just before we do pivot is, for me, what really stood out about looking at our history was really beginning to understand in a way I had not before the American invention of slavery, that it was different from Greek slavery, different from illicit sex trafficking, but this notion that the victim of slavery was always blamed. And that you could not resist, you could not run away. If she makes the point where, if you're a victim of slavery now, you run away, there's you were held, you were helped, and there's a notion that there can be legal consequences against those folks. And in this case, we have, in fact, the development of a policing system. So it was really wrenching for me to delve into that and just think more about how that was so active in our country. She points out, longer than our country has been a country. We have 2 more years to equal the amount of time.
Yeah, Elaine was talking about, this trying to reinforce and buttress the system, through education or miseducation in that point. But that's how the big structures work. That's how we influence the structures. But we kind of want to be able to, as I think it was Barbara who was talking about being nice on an individual level. And so and leaving the structures alone. There's a wonderful quote she has on page 72 that race and caste are not the cause and do not account for every poor outcome or unpleasant encounter. But caste becomes a factor to whatever infinitesimal degree in interactions and decisions across gender, ethnicity, race, immigrant status, sexual orientation, age, or religion that have consequences in our everyday lives and in policies that affect our country and beyond. It's both the personal interaction and it's the structure. And I think they kind of play off of each other in a way. One maintains a structure and the structure also shapes us a lot. I was wondering what you guys thought about, how she defined how race and caste sort of overlap or intersect.
And I think she plays that out on page 70.
I think she could have done a bit more. I think she could have expanded the definitions, the numbers of castes in this country. Often when I was reading it, it sounded to me like she thought it was binary. There were two castes. But I think there's a lot more than two. As somebody was pointing out, white trash. In my in-laws grew up in my mother-in-law grew up in Cincinnati, and there was a very distinct difference between the white people who live in Cincinnati and the white people who come up from the hollers in Kentucky to work in the plants in Ohio. And there was a lot of gradations. I think there's a lot of gradations within the two dominant castes.
I agree with you. My ex-husband was from Guatemala. He was Mayan. And he told me that when he came to this country, one of the things he learned very quickly was the best way to get accepted was to be negative about Black people. And then suddenly he was all right. He got accepted into that caste instead of being pushed down into along with the Black people.
I don't know if it was in this book or maybe in reading Stamp from the Beginning, which I still haven't finished, where they talk about how the difference was made between the enslaved African Americans and white people who were in servitude, and the structure, so to speak, of separating those white people from the Black caste in a sense. And that I think very much still exists, and just what people have just been saying.
Yeah, I think it's great how much we are talking about race in the Episcopal Church right now, but we also do have to talk about class, and they tie together so much, not just to the extent that they map over each other, but because of the fact that part of the way racism functions is to allow people in lower classes to believe that they're really on the same level as people in a higher class if they're white, and to not join in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in their class because they have to think they're better than them. You know, and I agree. Who was it that was saying about this almost seeming like there's a binary? I don't think she really means that, but it does come off that way sometimes. And I think class is, you know, she talks about class being something you can work your way out of, but it's not that easy to do. I'm very decidedly working class, which is, you know, not typical of the Episcopal Church so much in my experience. And I fear that might be part of the reason we don't talk about class very much, because, you know, it's not comfortable.
Yeah, and I think she kind of looks at that when she relates that incident with when she was working for the New York Times and she went to do that interview.
Yes, yeah.
She could work herself out of being, well, sort of, I guess, work herself into the way where you'd be in the I guess upper middle class if you're going to be a New York Times reporter. But she could not work her way out of the caste of race.
Right.
So she walks into this interview. Yeah, she has really moved up class-wise in the world, but she's still dealing with the caste of race when this guy just refuses to believe that this kind of person can be a reporter for the New York Times.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the distinction is that
I agree with that. Yeah. One of the difficulties is that, yeah, you can learn or work your way out of a lower class, but you do so by faking it, playing a role. You know, I was told it at a former job that I didn't play the role well enough. You know, there's a part you have to play, and people can tell by the way you speak, the language you use, and you may not even be aware of a lot of things going on because there's a different culture involved.
Yeah, and it was really interesting.
I'm not trying to equate the two. Don't get me wrong.
Remember the incident? She talks about the incident where she was in, I believe, I'm not sure if she was in India, but she was at a conference, And she began to recognize where people were, who was in the upper caste and who was not. Because, and I love the way she says that. She says, in the case of an upper caste person, they showed, and this is her language, an inescapable certitude in bearing, demeanor, behavior, a visible expectation of centrality.
Mm-hmm.
And that was you know, that defined her as being an upper caste person, is that, yes, I'm meant to be central. I can walk in here and own the room. Or, you know, as Bob said, if you're a white guy, you walk in the room, you know, you own it already. And ask a very good question. Can we find a word to use instead of race? Because it gives credence to an artificial construct that really doesn't exist. And this was one reason that, you know, in Isabel Wilkerson, when she wrote her first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, she did not use the word race in that book. And it really surprised people that she wrote this entire book about the Great Migration without using the word race. And I think if you have the answer, please let us know. Because, yeah, we need to understand that we're talking about an artificial construct, not a biological reality. Bonnie, you were getting ready to say something.
Well, you know what? I saw that Teresa Kolak, we haven't heard from you, and you did manage to raise your hand. I think you managed to put it back down, so you get double points. But so Teresa, you wanted to say something?
Sure. I'm from Holy Faith in Saline. I was thinking immediately when I read that about women working their way up into male-dominated areas, when I was thinking of class and how that's playing out so publicly, you know, in the last 10 years.
Yeah. And there seems to be, Teresa, there seems to be so much that she's gotten here that I could see parallels, and you don't have to be that bright to see the parallels that she was doing. When let's do for a moment, let's go to the Nazi Germany piece. I confess yet more ignorance. I did not know that Nazi Germany based so much of its laws on our race laws. I mean, just stunning. And this notion that ours were like, oh, that's too drastic. But this notion, what do you think about this, friends? How they're like, how do they do that and still have this robust innocence? How did we wind up being able to do that?
Bonnie, I don't know how we did that, but the church did it also.
Yeah, same.
I mean, well, most of Hitler's edicts and laws were based on earlier church law. So you can trace the anti-Semitism from particularly John's gospel, but from the early gospels all the way up to Nazi Germany and find precedents for what Hitler did in church law, canon law. And that's frightening.
But aren't we really good at taking pride in, I mean, as Americans, aren't we really good at taking pride and in the Declaration of Independence and in our founding and how that makes us special, and that city on a hill, and isn't that the innocence that, I mean, that's what I was thinking about when Isabel Wilkerson was talking about that this innocence that we have. I would call it a false pride today, but it's definitely a part of our makeup, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I think we've believed our own press.
Yes.
It struck me, well, a couple of things struck me. One, remembering Jesse Owens in the and the Berlin Olympics right around that time, doing a fine job to obliterate all of that. But that notion where they're like, but why did they not include Jews? I mean, and then you just sort of get this sense of how arbitrary all of this is.
Mm-hmm.
These social constructs that humanity has continually created to keep other people, some up and some down. Bill, you've got your hand up?
Yes. Am I unmuted? Yes. It's an important thing to figure out how something gets into society and becomes the truth, you know, to the point where the horrible things we do are accepted as not being horrible. And I think the beginning of it is when prejudiced people on the fringe create truisms. And by saying the truisms over and over and over again, they eventually become true.
Mm-hmm.
Or accept, not true.
Accept.
Culturally true, yeah.
Right.
But
so I think that's the beginning of the process that ends up with our doing horrible things and getting away with it, not having the public think of them as horrible at all.
Yeah, but I'm not sure ours always have come from the fringe.
Well, it begins at the, well, no, but it may begin at the fringe and get picked up by other people in society.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's the fringe. I think the, yeah. But Carol,
Well, the fringe has clearly gotten much larger. I think we used to think the fringe was 20%. I think we've learned the fringe has gotten to be quite a bit larger.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, 50%, you know.
Yeah.
And then the other 50%, how many are thinking and acting daily, but still voting, you know, away from that group? It's been a bad season, and it's going to get worse. So
I think we kind of wish that white supremacy was the fringe, but that's, again, the book tells that's what we were founded on, is white supremacy, you know, and if it's founded, it can't be fringe.
That's my point. Carol, you have to stand up and we're going to get ready to wrap up. So, and you're muted.
You're still muted.
You're still muted. Carol, you're muted. How many people, when this pandemic is done, are going to miss the phrase, "you're muted"?
I said, it strikes me that this may go back to Cain and Abel. Whose sacrifice was more acceptable? Who became the forebear of the person who pleased God? And somehow Cain had to put him down, put him in his place in order to feel okay about himself.
So Carol, that was just an awesome segue. Thank you.
My middle name.
Awesome segue. All right. So here's something for us to ponder for just a couple minutes before Bishop Bonnie closes us in prayer, but for you to spend a little more time with between this week's session and next week's. So thinking of Cain and Abel, thinking of how long, you know, we've had human hierarchies in us, and then thinking about the work of redemption of Jesus. How do we as people of faith intentionally, specifically, and actively work to live outside the caste system? Just take a minute or so of silence to just think about that, and then maybe between the weeks, just keep writing stuff down that comes to you. So just take a minute with that. How do we as people of faith intentionally, specifically, and actively work to live outside the caste system? All right, hopefully we have your your thoughts starting to spin on that. So just a reminder, next week we'll be looking at the next section. I think we're looking at 3 and 4 next week. Thank you. Yes, I have not been able to put this book down, so I'm like way ahead. So yeah, sections 3 to 4 next week. I can tell you right now that she'll be covering some of the topics that we raised this evening, and she has some really interesting perspectives on them. So spend some time with that question in the meantime, and Bishop Bonnie, you get to close us in prayer.
Okay. And friends, I also want to make sure you note in your calendars the memorial service for George Floyd, mark the 1-year anniversary. We'll be having that service goes live at 8 o'clock, and presiding Bishop Michael Curry will be preaching at it. And I can assure you that the Diocese of Michigan is well represented, including former Michigander Dion Johnson, Bishop of Missouri now, who put together the liturgy. But we're going to have a 7:45 pre-service gathering, prayer, and just Zoom call for us to be together before we watch. And then we'll reconvene after the service about 8:45 for question, answer, conversation. So I want to just make sure you know that, get it out on your social media and Facebook pages, and please invite folks. So we've got 11 or 14 dioceses taking part, including 3 dioceses from Canada. So the Diocese of the Diocese of the Territories, which is sort of the upper area, Nova Scotia and PEI, Prince Edward Island, and then Toronto. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Thank you. Let us pray. Christ be within us to keep us, beside us to enlighten us, before us to lead us, behind us to protect us, beneath us to support us, above us to bless us. Go in peace, friends. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Back next week.
Thank you.
Bring some friends.
Yeah.
Wonderful discussion.